This episode of the 24 Today podcast is called, Why Do You Keep Saying I'm Sorry? There's a verse in Scripture that talks about how many times we need to forgive somebody. And that verse is, the background of it is when a guy named Simon Peter comes up to Jesus and says, how many times am I supposed to forgive my brother or my sister? And it's in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. And the Jewish people of the Bible days had come up with an idea that you only have to forgive someone up to 7 times. And so he says to Jesus, in essence, am I just supposed to forgive him 7 times? And Jesus says, no, you're supposed to forgive him 70 times 7. And it's not about the number. Jesus was saying here, it's not about the number. But what it is about is that there is no number. That we should always be willing to continue to have an open heart toward forgiving a person who's honestly seeking it. Now, the Bible doesn't ever talk about the number of times that we are to say, I'm sorry. It just, in this general way, says that we're always supposed to have an open mind toward forgiving. And again, the name of this podcast is, Why Do You Keep Saying I'm Sorry? Have you ever had an occasion in which you hurt someone, you did something that was offensive toward someone, and you felt bad about it, and so you went to that person and you, with all sincerity, apologized, and then a month later you were on the phone with that same person, or you were in some kind of situation, and you brought that up again, even though a month before you had apologized and that person, as far as you know, had sincerely forgiven you, but you felt the need to bring it back up again and say you're sorry again. Or have you ever been in the situation where you had forgiven someone of something, maybe even 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months ago? You'd forgiven them, but then later on they bring it up and you say, I really had totally forgotten about that. And in some occasions you might not even remember it at all. But that person is apologizing again. And the question I have for that is why? Why do you or I feel this need to continue to apologize, say I'm sorry for something that is done and over with? Something that, in all honesty, has been forgiven, but we continue to bring it up. I mean, it could be as something as little as forgetting to meet somebody for lunch when you had scheduled that with them. And so the next time you do meet 6 weeks later for lunch, you have to bring that up again and say, man, I'm really sorry. And it's like, they're saying, okay, that was 6 weeks ago, and that was 6 weeks ago. I mean, That was 6 weeks ago. So yeah, we had that conversation and it was over and done with. But what we did was we carried with us 6 weeks of negativity in our heart. And negativity is negativity, however it comes out or however it looks. The word negative is not a good thing. We carried around for 6 weeks something in our spirit, in our soul, that was an incident left open for 6 weeks. Even though we had done the right thing, we had apologized, and that person had forgiven, and so that incident should have been closed. We left it open and carried around 6 weeks of something open. And that wears on our spirit. It just does when we won't let ourselves get over something wrong that we did. It in some way hurts our confidence when we can't shut things and go on. Because what happens is we do this not only with one thing, but we do it with several things. And so we have these opened incidents in our life that very well could be closed. I mean, you know that there are things that people won't close that we wish they would, and so those are bad enough, but then we also combine with that things that we just don't close when they could be. It hurts our image about ourselves. It hurts our joy, and it hurts our energy, our spiritual energy level, because all negativity in our spirit takes energy away from living today and living life. And any container that remains open is something that is attached to the past, and it keeps us attached to the past. Even though we don't live in the past anymore, emotionally we are still connected to a day that doesn't even exist. Yesterday is gone, but somehow emotionally we try to stay connected to that, and that takes energy. One morning last winter, I was sitting in my house, and I had earlier let the dogs outside, out the front door, and it was a really cold, nasty winter day, and I had left them outside, or taken them outside, brought them back in, and then had sat down back in my living room to watch TV or something. And I noticed probably about 40 minutes later that it seemed cold in the room. It seemed cold in the house. And I looked at the thermometer in the, or the gauge in the house. It's not called a thermometer, thermostat, and it seemed to be a little cooler than it should have been. So I got up and started looking around, and here the front door was open. I had shut it when I came back in, but hadn't been careful enough to shut it in a way that it actually latched. And so the little latch wasn't secure, and apparently the wind outside had blown that door open, and I didn't know it. And so for 40 minutes, the front door on a freezing cold winter day was letting in cold air and letting the nice warm air outside. And I mentioned that because this is the way it is when we do not shut things from the past that we should shut, especially things that are within our own power to shut. We won't let go of it. Even though the other person is willing to, we won't say, okay, I'm human, I made a mistake, I did something I wish I hadn't have done, but God forgives me, the other person forgives me. Now I need to forgive myself and just shut the door to that, the container, and move on. And when we don't, it is like this front door to our heart that stays open, and it lets the cold air of negativity, the cold air of a lack of confidence, the cold air of a self-image that just never quite gets to where it should be in God. It lets joy escape, or the joy we have is cooled off because of the front door of our heart is left open, and our energy is drained out that door. And then there's the relationship itself that you have with the person that you apologize to. It keeps that relationship connected to a past experience. It slows down your relationship from moving forward at the pace that it ought to, because you keep forcing it back to that bad time every time you say, I'm sorry. You and the other person have to relive that moment again, even if just briefly, but you still have to go back there, feel the negative thoughts and the memories in order to go on in the day or with the relationship. But whenever you or I, because I've done this before also, whenever we do that, it just puts that relationship in a kind of a hold pattern. So just ask yourself, if you have an open container, ask yourself, has God forgiven you? And the answer to that is yes, if you've asked God for forgiveness. And if you don't believe that, then your problem really is a believing Scripture problem and believing God problem at His Word. That's probably where you need to start on this issue. But ask yourself, has God forgiven me? And if the answer is yes, then ask yourself, have you forgiven yourself? And that might be a harder one. But if you haven't forgiven yourself, and God has, what that does is it exposes an area of pride in you. And it says that even though God Almighty has forgiven, even though God, the King of the universe, is able to forgive, you put yourself over God and say, but I can't forgive, even though He says it should be forgiven. And then you've got a problem there also that you have to really deal with. But if if God has forgiven you and if you have forgiven you, then ask yourself, well, is your friend the type of friend, or whoever you've asked for forgiveness, is your type of a friend that you have someone that is honest, or do they lie to you? I mean, when they said that they forgive you, can you really trust them? Or do they lie? Do they not honestly tell the truth? And if they are a person that does tell the truth, then you are calling them a liar in essence, and you have to accept the truth that that's just what they said and what they really meant. And if you can't trust them, and if you're not sure that they're telling you the truth, then that's another level that you need to maybe discuss in another way with them. It's a bigger issue than just you continuing to say your sorrow or express your sorrow to them. Now, I've given you a lot to think about today, but in general, let me give you this goal, and that is to honestly ask to be forgiven one time. And forgive yourself when you ask for that forgiveness. Forgive yourself. I mean, after all, you are only human. And then also ask God for forgiveness. And if you ask God for forgiveness, then trust that He has forgiven you. And if you've asked your friend or the other person in the relationship for forgiveness and they have said that they are sorry, then accept that and never bring it up again. Don't refer to it again. A month from now, 6 months from now, just let it go and close that container and let the relationship live in the present. So if your friend happens to bring it up again at some point, then there's another kind of issue that you have to deal with. Either your friend really didn't forgive, or maybe your friend doesn't realize that it's hurting you and that they're being insensitive to you. And so that's another discussion that has to be had. But again, the thought is, let's get used to living in the present by closing things of the past. So my goal for you right now is to encourage you to do what you can do to live in peace on this day. What has been forgiven, let it be forgiven. And I'll just give you a practical exercise if this helps, because we're tangible people. Write that thing out, or things that you've asked for forgiveness of and you're feeling a hard time letting it go, even though you know God has and the person has that you offended. Write it out on paper and then get some white out and put that white out generously over that ink that represents whatever it is that you haven't forgiven and you keep open, and white it out and give it up, hold it up to God and say, God, here, it's yours. I'm giving this to you. Help me now to totally let it go so that I can enjoy this day and live in this 24-hour period. Thanks for listening. If this podcast has been helpful for you and you haven't already subscribed, just go to the subscribe button that you'll see on the page and subscribe. That way you'll make sure that you get everything that I put on the podcast the moment that it's available. And if it's helpful for you, it probably would be helpful for someone that you know as well. If you could send them a link or tell them about the podcast, and then also comment on the particular podcast wherever you're at. Rate it, if you will, and that will help others to be able to see and hear about the podcast.